So your book says where we went wrong. It goes back about 50 years. How did we get to be a country that doesn't put in vigorous effort to help those who are struggling? What happened? What happened historically?
I think.
Okay.
I think a couple of things happened. One is that I think we ended up with that other OECD countries ended up evolving toward universal health care, toward broader education, toward social supports. And that meanwhile, we ended up adopting a social narrative that was all, as Sheryl said, about personal responsibility in ways that made it harder to provide supports, to provide investment in human capital. And I think that, the timing of this is curious, that things begin to go wrong around 1970. And that kind of coincides with the Nixon Southern strategy. And that was so in the 1960s, there really was a broad effort by Bobby Kennedy in particular, to have the white and black working classes work together to put pressure on employers, but also on the government. And then Nixon's Southern strategy basically put an end to that and lured away the white working class followed by Reagan, to increasingly back Nixon, Reagan, especially in the South, but later in industrial states. And I think that was what blocked the US from adopting the kind of trajectory that Canada and Europe pursued.
You have a comment, Sheryl?
No, I mean, just the number, like the war on drugs that I mentioned is a perfect example of policy making that we really should have tweaked when we realized that it wasn't working. And that's something really important. It's the mark of a flexible economy. And capitalism is basically a movable, living, breathing model. And it, goes through, poor rulemaking and better rulemaking. But we have to realize that we can change the rules when we see things are wrong. And I think that, the war on drugs is an example of, it was 1986, 1988, and we saw, long after that we knew things were wrong, but we didn't change anything. We've got to be a little bit bolder to see, when we see problems, we should fix them.
Actually, Sheryl has a point that I would have mentioned too. I think the capitalist model in the U.S. changed around that same period, and that private sector labor unions in particular tended to lose power, corporations tended to gain power and political influence, and I think that has also been part of the erosion of working class wages.
So we overshoot. So in other words, you don't have to take all of the power from the unions and give it all to business. There really should be a balance so that there is tension. And we just have to be a little bit more sort of balanced about our approach.
Speaking about presidents and white working class voting against their interest, it is just unfathomable to so many of us why Trump is gaining so much support from this group.
So
we
started out asking the question, why are these people voting for Trump? I mean, the book became a lot more than that, because as we started learning more about these people, we just saw their lives were just unraveling. But to address this directly, you don't always get a satisfying answer. But you do see that this obviously was just a cry for help. But when we did ask some people, I'll sort of give you an example. One of them, he has his own business, his very own small business, and we asked him, why does he support Trump? And he does, watch only a certain, cable station, and he loves his guns. And so when there is anybody who says I'm for gun control, he's not voting for that person. So that's one person. The second person doesn't like immigrants. I mean, he is a cement finisher, and he thinks that immigrants are taking his job, even though he is a little bit. He's not really that hardworking, and so but he feels threatened by them. So he hates immigrants, so that's why he likes Trump. The third, a woman, so I asked her, why do you support Trump? And she goes, well, you know, for me, Trump represents family values.
Yeah, Nick, in your book, you also talk about not only are we talking about the rise of Trump, but the rise of Bernie Sanders, this same phenomenon.
Yeah, you know, I think among a lot of voters, there was just a sense that the system had failed. And both in the Republican primary and in the general election 2016, there's a lot of talk about how Trump voters correlate to bigotry, to racism, sexism, and so on. They also correlate, one of the correlations is that Trump did particularly well in areas that had higher deaths of despair. And, you know, when your friends are dying around you and the system is not responding, then you are angry and you are desperate. And if you have been raised in a kind of a traditional conservative value, then if somebody is good at blaming immigrants or promising that manufacturing is going to revive, then you don't know whether it's true, but you may be willing to take a risk. And it's worth pointing out that these are not problems that Trump created or that one party created. These are problems created over 50 years by both parties. Both parties blew it on mass incarceration. Both parties blew it on the war on drugs. You know, obviously I'm much more aligned with the Obama administration than, say, with the Bush administration. But after the 08-09 economic crisis, it was striking that the United States intervened to help Wall Street, and 10 million people lost their homes, and they did not get rescued. So there is a lot of anger out there, and one of my frustrations is that Democrats, since Bobby Kennedy, have not been very good at speaking to white working class voters, some better than others and so on, but it's something, there is a inadvertent tendency to sometimes come across as condescending. And these days, there's such polarization that I think that risk is magnified. On the other hand, among a lot of white working class voters, you know, on the one hand, culturally, they're more aligned with Trump. I mean, many of them believe abortion is murder. They deeply care about Supreme Court judges and so on. Guns, as Sheryl mentioned. On the other hand, issues like raising the minimum wage poll incredibly well. Broader health care. I mean, we have some problems right now in the Democratic Party over Medicare for all, but the idea of universal access to health care is broadly popular. In places like Yamhill, bandwidth for all, modeled on rural electrification, is kind of a no-brainer. And so I think that there are, I think that if the right candidate spoke to these voters, then some would be torn and they would say, well, I don't like your position on abortion or on guns, but I do like your position on the minimum wage, on unions, on health care. And it would be possible to win some of those votes, and I hope that the Democratic Party does fight for every one of those votes.
Let's go there. So what would be your advice to the presidential candidates on the Democratic side?
Well, I do think that it's very important to address head-on some of these problems in the working class world, because I think that the term middle class is used more frequently, maybe because those are the people who they think vote more. But I do think working class is really important, and that's where the troubles are. But directly addressing some of the pain, I mean, and speaking to them in a language that they can understand. What's funny is that I do sometimes think that, at least in the Democratic campaigns so far, I guess maybe except for Biden, but everybody is so hyper articulate. I mean, boy, they can like out-talk, me and out-talk, maybe even Nick. I don't know. They're just so perfectly articulate. But that doesn't necessarily reach a lot of people in the working class, some of whom don't even have a high school degree. And so you have to sort of speak to them, speak their language. And I think that, so far, I don't see that being done. Maybe Biden is better at it than others. So far, I'm not sure that message is really reaching these people. I mean, the ones that we've talked to, just last night. So one of the people in the Green family, he's going to vote for Trump, and his nephew is also going to vote for Trump because they don't like the Democrats, and the Democrats aren't going to help them with anything.
Do you see these candidates identifying the problems that you're identifying and coming up with offering the solutions that you want?
Do I think Trump?
Yeah,
Well,
our
no,
Democratic
so for
presidential
instance-
candidites, are they offering the solutions that you want?
Well, so
to
for
save the
instance,
vote?
college access, that is really important, of course, and we know there's issues with student debt and all, but high school, already we have only 84% of high schoolers in the U.S. graduate from high school. So that means there's a huge swath of people who still are not even graduating high school. We should be addressing that in addition to college access, but basically the argument's only about college access. And what about early childhood education? No one's even talking about that, but that is the cheapest way to actually redirect a lot of these people born in zip codes where you can predict the outcome, the negative outcomes of babies. That's the most effective and cheapest way of really helping these people.
Yeah, I do think that the Democratic candidates are, beginning to work through policies that do resonate among these voters, and I think child care programs, which again, just about every other country has figured out, vastly improve the lives of families and also greatly help young children. As I said, bandwidth for all seems a no-brainer, a modern version of rural electrification. Raising the minimum wage, some kind of jobs programs for those who have trouble finding jobs, and there's a debate about how broad that should be. I also think that one has to address some of the suspicions that people have toward Democratic candidates, and talking about faith, I think, is a useful way of reassuring people. Pete Buttigieg does that, I'd say, most naturally, but Elizabeth Warren has done that as well. And I think that, that is part of the effort to try to make people feel that the Democratic Party can be a home again, coupled with just pointing out the degree to which President Trump did not drain the swamp, but hugely expanded it. The sense of, I think that the idea that you have been manipulated by President Trump is a powerful message, that he thought that he could pull one over on you, and he rigged the system and put in people who've manipulated it for their benefit. I think that is a powerful potential message out there. I think we'll see some of that.
Is the fundamental problem the disappearance of good blue-collar jobs? And if so, why is that, and what's the answer?
So, right now in the United States, there are actually more jobs available than there are people seeking jobs. So it's not so much that there are no jobs, it's that there are a lot of people who are kind of broken, if you will. And so half of the prime age men who have dropped out of the labor force take a pain pill every day. For Tightrope, Sheryl and I looked at McDonald's workers in Denmark and in the US. In Denmark, McDonald's pays about $20 an hour to people working at McDonald's flipping burgers. Well, how is it that that business model works in Denmark but would not work in the US? And it's complicated, but it turns out that in part, it's because people who work at McDonald's all over the world, unless they're students, tend to be kind of at the lower end of the labor force. But a person who is at the lower end of the labor force in Denmark is a high school graduate who is literate, is numerate, does not have any dependency, is actually highly productive. And as a result, McDonald's gets $20 an hour out of productivity out of them. Because of our failures to invest in human capital in this country, and because of the despair that trickles through so much of the country, a lot of the people at the lower end of the US labor market are not high school graduates. They are not literate. They are not numerate. They do have dependencies. At least 7 million of them have had their driver's license suspended. And so commuting to work is unreliable and deeply problematic. And so part of what we need to do is things like raising the minimum wage and empowering unions, but it also has to be investing in the capital of those who've been left behind so that their productivity can actually compete with those in other countries.
The scope in your book, the scope of investments that you touch on historically that America's done are a great part of your book. You cite the GI Bill, FHA, the Homestead Act. Morning Joe, you mentioned the superhighway that we built. I mean, could you expound here on the massive investments that you're talking about that historically we can identify with as Americans?
Well, let me also compare it to other countries, because your question about that, you know, globalization certainly did affect manufacturing jobs, but if you look at other OECD countries, if you look at Europe, Germany, Canada, they also are affected by globalization, but they have been more resilient. And we used to be an incredibly resilient economy. I think we've become less so, a little bit more rigid than those countries. So case in point, if you look at after the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, when auto workers were laid off both in Detroit and in Windsor, or Ontario, Canada, it was an interesting way to compare what happened. So in Detroit, the auto workers were laid off, and because of the extreme circumstances, they were given extra unemployment benefits and cash, a little bit more cash. But they had no health care. So, I mean, they're fretting. Their families are just going nuts about what are we going to do about health care. And so then, if you look at what happened in Windsor, these auto workers were laid off, but first of all, their families still had the health care, so they didn't have to worry about that. Second, Canada does really well with retraining. They have these activity centers, where they kick into action when there are grand layoffs. And so they looked in the area at the employers and saw what the demand for jobs was, and they discovered that it was in nursing. So they put together nursing training programs. So they retrain these auto workers so they actually can go into nursing. Now, of course, not everybody's going to want to do that, but those who did, they were able to reintegrate back into society much more quickly. And then you don't have, several years later, the kind of entanglement in drugs and alcoholism that we have here in the US. So that's one example. The other example, in terms of investment, you say, in these large programs, yes, we did have investments in the GI Bill. And, for instance, out in Oregon, and I'm sure, and also in many places, I mean, everybody talks about the pioneering spirit. Here in America, and in Texas, everyone has the pioneering spirit, right? Well, we always forget to say that there's this thing called the Homestead Act that allowed people to migrate to other areas, and if you just sat yourself down, you'd get 640 acres. Well, that's a nice incentive there. That really isn't mentioned when you say I had the pioneering spirit to go out and find a place in Oregon. So investment is really important. I want to talk a little bit very quickly about the UK and how it was very successful in tackling child poverty. So Tony Blair said, we're just going to tackle child poverty. More than 1 in 4 kids in the UK in 1999 were considered poor. That was slightly more than in the US, so they had a big problem with child poverty. Over 10 years of all sorts of programs, from literacy programs, child tax credits, child allowances, better maternity leave, paid maternity leave extended to 9 months for mothers, all sorts of other programs, nurse visitation programs, all the things that all the researchers say that you should do to improve child poverty, they did it. And they cut the number of children in poverty by half. So it is doable. It did cost quite a bit of money. It was the equivalent of $130 billion, but we can afford that.
Nick, you want to talk about our broad history of these big investments?
Yeah, I mean, it's striking in Oregon. Our area was transformed by the combination of public legislation and private initiatives. So the Homestead Acts they laid the basis for Oregon. Then rural electrification was critical to the farming communities. The GI Bill of Rights allowed people to get an education and to build and to get homes. And likewise, we tend to forget that the US was really the country that invented mass education. So Europe had great elite education. And so if you went to Eton and then Oxford, you probably had just about the best education in the world. But if you were a ordinary kid somewhere in the US, you went to a okay elementary school, and you were much more likely to go to high school than a British or French kid. And later, so the US pioneered mass secondary education, then pioneered mass tertiary education, and both community colleges and public colleges, which initially were kind of free. And one example of the impact of that, we write about a girl called Mary Daly who grew up in Missouri and was a bright kid, but her dad worked for the post office. He was fired. That caused strains in the marriage. The parents divorced. And Mary, at age 15, dropped out of high school. She worked in a donut shop. Then a local college teacher called Betsy Bain heard about this, heard there was this bright kid who had dropped out at 15, and told Mary Daly to take the GED, at least get a GED. So Mary took the GED. She did very, very well on it. And then Betsy Bain said, look, you should, take some classes at the local college. It's almost free. And Mary said, I can't afford that. Betsy Bain said, look, I'll pay your first semester. Mary Daly went, was a brilliant student. After the first semester, she got scholarships, earned her BA, her master's, her PhD, got a job, became an economist, joined the San Francisco Fed, and is now president of the San Francisco Fed, focusing on inequality. Now, obviously, that's a benefit for Mary Daly, but it's also a benefit for the country. And when you have people who can live up to their talents, then that's kind of a basic condition for a country living up to its potential as well.
So pay attention to all those people working in donut shops.
Yeah.
2 more questions. In your book, you say the paramount lesson is to get America back in the escalator business. And in that sentence, you emphasize get back to the escalator business. What do you mean by that?
So basically, education is the escalator out of poverty. I mean, it really is the tried and true escalator out of poverty. I mean, it's not 100%, but it really is the way that we can lift all Americans. And the problem is that for many of those people who need that escalator the most, it's broken. And we do need to get back to early childhood education, to primary school, to high school, secondary school, and to tertiary schools. I mean, the entire, not just college access, we need it all the way. And so, it's great when, some states are really doing a great job with preschool, and that's terrific. I really applaud that. And I think that, early childhood, even earlier, that those 0 to 5 years are when the baby's brain is developing at the most rapid rate it ever will as an individual, as an adult. Our brain is not growing as fast as it was when we were 0 to 5 years of age. The problem is that is when the brain is the most sensitive as well. So when you get stressed out, babies do get stressed out. And when you get stressed out, there's cortisol rushing through your brain, and that affects the building of the architecture of your brain and can impair it. And so it really is a critical stage, and so we do need to catch those kids when they're very young and create more baby Ashtons who will grow up and be really successful.
Yeah, I would say that the period when we were most in the escalator business was 1945 to roughly the early 70s. And at that time, economic growth was robust, but it was also very inclusive. And economic gaps were actually diminishing, not increasing. It was also a time, and so what was going on then? There were, tax rates were actually very high. They were, for a while, they were 91, federal marginal rate was 91%. So it was not that there were some low tax rates encouraging rapid economic growth. There were a lot of public investments in infrastructure, both physical and human. So you had interstate highways being rolled out. You also had state colleges and universities being rolled out. You had huge expansions in high school education. High school graduation rates soared. Community colleges were built and provided almost free. There were huge investments in America's intellectual capital, human capital, but also in the physical basis for more rapid economic growth. And I sometimes wonder why it is that today there is so much demagoguery about people of other races or ethnic groups or immigration status, and how it was that in the 1960s we were able to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, et cetera. And I think part of it was that living standards for a lot of ordinary workers, including the white working class, were increasing. So they were feeling a little more willing to be inclusive, to let somebody else in at the table. For Americans born in 1944, at age 30, 90% were earning more than their parent of the same gender had earned at that age. For those born in 1984, that has dropped to half. Women are slightly more likely to earn more than their mothers had earned. Men are less. Most men have earned less than their dads did at that age. And when you're doing worse than your dad was at that time, it's much easier to fall prey to demagogues who scapegoat particular groups, who say they're coming to get your job, they're changing your culture. And so that's why we need to get in the escalator business, not only to help those who need that escalator, but for the health of the country as a whole.
In my last question, in your book you say, the country may be ready for big steps. What are your reasons for hope?
So since roughly 1970, there has been this tendency, both at the federal and state level and in many parts of the country, in cutting taxes and curbing investment in human capital. And this was a strategy that, for a time, was plausible, that one could argue that, okay, some southern states cut taxes, cut regulations, and factories genuinely did move to those states from the northern industrial states. It did seem to be working. I think that it's now pretty clear that that model has failed, both because of the environmental degradation that has resulted, and because when you don't invest in schools, then, South Carolina schools are a catastrophe, and it's no accident that Amazon and Apple are not moving to South Carolina. Human capital is what is the basis for growth these days. And so the southern states had gained ground on the rest of the country for much of the 20th century. Since, in more recent decades, they've been losing ground in ratio of per capita incomes again. And so I think that one issue is that the model of cutting taxes and cutting investments has, to some degree, failed. In Kansas, the idea that Kansas would actually vote to increase taxes because schools were so bad, that felt to me like maybe it's a turning point. And I hope so. So that's one reason why I wonder if we are ready to reinvest in America. And another just is the fact that the Republican Party in particular is going through this complete reorientation. Trump's Republican Party is completely different from George W. Bush's. Deficit spending is not an issue anymore. And the fact that some of these public investments, like childcare, like early childhood education, poll so well, and in fact have been introduced to some degree in red states. Oklahoma has a great early childhood program. Makes me think that we may finally be ready to take a new course for the country. And we wrote Tightrope in part to try to feed that interest and whack on the head some people who don't yet see that.
Sheryl, what's your reasons for hope?
I think that we never before have had so much research and evidence that shows that there are solutions to a lot of these problems. I mean, I think that, for the past few decades, people say, well, we don't really know what works. So when we launched the war on drugs, actually Portugal embarked on another experiment that no one knew which one would work. Well, Portugal did, so what we did is we actually threw everybody in jail who had anything to do with drugs, and so we just built more jails. We thought that was the solution. What Portugal did was they chose the public health toolbox, and they basically said that we will treat drug addiction like a health problem. And so they took all these people and they put them in drug treatment. And they had, safe needle exchanges. They did all sorts of things to really help people get help. And so now they've dropped the heroin overdose rate by 2/3. They have the lowest drug overdose rate in Europe. It's not zero yet, but they still have done remarkably well. So we see that works. We have results. We have data now. We have so much more data in all of these other areas that shows that we actually are ripe for change. We can rely on these solutions. And I also think there's growing recognition that capitalism isn't working for everybody. When you get, so we were talking to a great economist, Alan Kruger, who is at Princeton. So unfortunately, he's passed away, but we were talking to him for this book, and he was the chief economist for the Council on Economic Advisors to Obama, a really brilliant labor economist. And we were asking him, kind of gently, don't you think that, the low-income segment of society, like how do they, this economy really isn't favoring them, right? And he thought for a moment, he said, the economy is definitely rigged against them. So he had such a perfect overview of the entire economy, and he says, yes, it's rigged. And then you get someone like Ray Dalio. There can't be a more capitalist person in America than Ray Dalio, who runs the largest hedge fund in the world. And he says capitalism is broken because he sees that it isn't working for a large part of America. So I do think that there's this growing recognition that we need to fix things.
Let's hope enough.
Touch wood.
Yeah, I have a gift for you all. Thank you for a special evening. We like to give clocks because we like to say it's our time. It's engraved with your name and tonight's date. Thank you for a special evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
This is perfect.